Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. There are kings who ruled well, and there are kings who became legends, and the two categories overlap less than posterity tends to assume. Tonight we're talking about a man who was, by the sober accounting of administrative history, a middling to poor King of England, who spent perhaps 6 months of his entire 10-year reign in the country he ruled, who extracted ruinous taxes from his subjects to fund a crusade and then a ransom, who left his kingdom to be governed by his mother and his ministers while he was fighting in the Holy Land or imprisoned in a German castle or campaigning in France. And yet, and this is the genuinely interesting thing, he became a legend so powerful and so immediate that it was already forming around him while he was still alive. The troubadours were writing songs about him. The chroniclers were reaching for extraordinary language to describe his campaigns. His enemies respected him. The man who commanded the army trying to kill him sent him fresh fruit when he was ill and asked after his health, and there is no record that he found this strange. Richard Gunn of England, called Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, was born in 1157 and died in 1199, and his 41 years produced a story dense enough to have sustained 7 centuries of retelling without running dry. Tonight we are going to tell it in full, and we are going to tell it with a question that serious historians have found interesting. How do you understand a man who was simultaneously a military genius of the First Order and a catastrophically negligent king, who could inspire absolute devotion in the men who served him and complete indifference to the kingdom that fed him, who showed mercy to the man who shot him and mass executed nearly 3,000 prisoners of war on a single afternoon, who wrote poetry in Occitan and spoke almost no English, who was in almost every meaningful sense a Frenchman wearing an English crown. How do you understand a man who is genuinely 2 things at once, a romantic legend and a political failure, and who managed to be both so fully and so simultaneously that neither cancels the other out? Before we can fully understand Richard, we need to understand the world he was born into, because that world, the 12th century world of the Crusades, the chivalric romance, the troubadour song, was not simply a backdrop to his story, but the cultural medium through which he understood himself and was understood by everyone around him. The crusading movement was not from the inside what it looks like from 8 centuries of hindsight. It was not primarily a story of religious violence and imperial expansion, though it was those things. From the inside, it was the defining collective project of Latin Christian civilization, the attempt to recover and hold the places where the Christian story had physically occurred, at the cost of whatever it cost, and the specific quality of the culture it produced was one in which the combination of military excellence and religious devotion was not merely acceptable, but was the highest possible expression of human virtue. Pope Urban II's call at Clermont in 1095 had launched the First Crusade with a speech whose effects its speaker could not have fully predicted. Urban's argument that Christian knights, whose violence against each other was an ongoing source of ecclesiastical concern, should redirect that violence outward toward the recovery of Jerusalem, both mobilized the genuine popular religious energy that the idea of the Holy City generated across all classes of European society, and gave the warrior aristocracy a framework within which their professional violence could be understood as meritorious rather than merely destructive. The First Crusade's success, the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, against all reasonable military prediction, gave the idea a historical validation that no subsequent Crusade's failure entirely erased. The Crusades that followed the first were less uniformly successful, but the model was established. The holy war fought by Christian knights against the enemies of the faith offered the possibility of spiritual merit proportionate to the physical cost, and the highest expression of that merit was to die in the Holy Land in service of the cross. Into this world Richard was born, and in this world he was formed. The chivalric code that the 12th century Romance tradition elaborated, the idea of the knight as simultaneously a fighter of unparalleled physical prowess and a person of refined courtesy, devoted to his lord and to his lady and to the church, capable of both extreme violence and extreme gentleness depending on the situation's demands, was not entirely fictional. It was an idealization of qualities that actually existed in some of the men who aspired to it, and Richard was widely understood by his contemporaries as the man who most completely embodied the ideal. This was not propaganda, though it was also that. It was the genuine assessment of people who had seen him fight. Richard thus of England, called Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, was born in 1157. How do you understand a man who was simultaneously a military genius of the first order and a catastrophically negligent king, who could inspire absolute devotion in the men who served him and complete indifference to the kingdom that fed him, who showed mercy to the man who shot him and mass executed nearly 3,000 prisoners of war on a single afternoon, who wrote poetry in Occitan and spoke almost no English, who was in almost every meaningful sense a Frenchman wearing an English crown? How do you understand a man who is genuinely two things at once, a romantic legend and a political failure, and who managed to be both so fully and so simultaneously that neither cancels the other out? Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely what you come here for. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. Knowing this is drifting over different latitudes simultaneously is something I always find quietly wonderful. Now dim the lights. The 12th century is a long way back and a world that requires some imagination to inhabit. Let the room go soft. You have nowhere to be. And let us begin with the family that made Richard possible. The most spectacularly dysfunctional royal family in English history, which is saying something given the competition. The Plantagenet dynasty that Richard was born into was not a dynasty in the calm, hereditary, God-given sense that medieval political theology described. It was an empire in process, a vast, restless, constantly contested accumulation of territories on both sides of the English Channel that existed because of a specific marriage in 1152, and that would be undone by the specific military failures of Richard's brother and successor John in the following century. At its height under Henry II, the Angevin Empire, Angevin from Anjou, the French county that gave the dynasty its alternate name, stretched from the border with Scotland in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, encompassing England, Normandy, Maine, Touraine, Anjou, Poitou, and the enormous Duchy of Aquitaine in southwestern France. It was, by the standards of 12th century Europe, an extraordinary concentration of power and territory in the hands of one ruling family. It was also, because of the specific political culture of the period, an extraordinary concentration of potential conflict. Henry II himself was one of the most remarkable monarchs of the medieval period, a man of volcanic energy, constant motion, and genuine administrative genius, who essentially created the common law tradition that still underlies the legal systems of England and its former colonies. He was also a man of violent temper, deeply suspicious of everyone around him, including his own family, and capable of both tremendous generosity and tremendous cruelty, depending on the precise configuration of political pressures at any given moment. His quarrel with Thomas Becket, his Archbishop of Canterbury, the dispute about the relationship between royal and ecclesiastical jurisdiction that ended with Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, by 4 knights who understood, correctly or not, that the king wanted Becket dead, was the defining scandal of Henry's reign and left marks on the medieval church's relationship to royal authority that lasted centuries. Henry's penance afterward, walking barefoot to Canterbury to be flogged by the monks, was the public performance of royal humiliation that the medieval political culture required, and it was performed by a man who was genuinely, if complicated, a Catholic believer as well as a calculating political operator. Eleanor of Aquitaine was, in almost every respect, Henry's equal, and the specific quality of their marriage, one of the most consequential in medieval history, deserves more than a brief mention. She'd inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine from her father Williamer at 15, becoming one of the wealthiest women in Europe and almost immediately one of the most politically exposed. She'd married Louis VII of France, accompanying him on the disastrous Second Crusade of 1147, and finding, in the courts and cities of the Mediterranean world, a cultural richness that the bleaker piety of the French royal court could not match. The stories that circulated about her conduct during the Crusade, the alleged liaison with her uncle Raymond of Antioch, the stories of impropriety that Louis's friends spread and that her enemies repeated for centuries, are mostly unverifiable and were partly political weapons wielded by people who found a powerful, independent-minded woman in a position of public authority threatening. What is clear is that by 1152 the marriage was over, annulled on grounds of consanguinity that were accurate in the technical sense, but whose invocation was primarily a convenient legal mechanism for ending an arrangement that neither party wanted to continue. 2 months after the annulment, she married Henry. He was 18, she was approximately 28, and the combination of his energy and ambition and military genius, with her wealth and political sophistication and territorial authority, created the Angevin Empire in a single ceremony. They spent the early years of the marriage in what appears to have been genuine partnership. Henry's campaigns depended on Aquitaine's resources, and Eleanor's management of the southern territories was critical to the empire's functioning. Their children began arriving: Henry, then Richard, then Geoffrey, then Eleanor, then Joan, then John, and others who did not survive infancy. They were, for a decade or so, a genuinely formidable political partnership. Then the partnership fractured. The causes are multiple and interrelated. Henry's infidelities, most publicly with Rosamund Clifford, whom the chroniclers described as his rose of the world, and whose relationship with Henry was public enough to be diplomatically embarrassing. Eleanor's exclusion from the real governance of England as Henry's administrative apparatus became self-sufficient. The specific conflict over Aquitaine and how its affairs should be managed, and the gradual accumulation of grievances that a marriage of 2 exceptionally strong-willed people living in the compressed political world of a dynastic court reliably generates when the political partnership begins to feel less equal than it was at the start. By the 1170s, Eleanor was living primarily in Aquitaine and had become the organising intelligence, if not the leader, of the rebellion of the sons against the father. In 1173, she apparently attempted to flee to France, disguised as a man to join her sons at the French court, was caught by Henry's agents, and was imprisoned for the remaining 15 years of Henry's reign. 16 years in relatively comfortable but real captivity, this was not a light punishment, and Eleanor understood it as the direct consequence of her political ambitions and her maternal loyalties. She did not emerge from it diminished. She emerged from it with the patient political intelligence of someone who had spent 16 years watching and waiting, and she deployed that intelligence with remarkable effect in the years of Richard's reign. Eleanor of Aquitaine was, in almost every respect, Henry's equal. which was itself the source of much of their conflict, because the medieval political and legal systems were not designed to accommodate women who were the intellectual and political equals of their husbands and who knew it. She had been Queen of France first, married to Louis VII, accompanying him on the Second Crusade in 1147 in circumstances whose specific details generated immediate scandal and speculation that has never quite been resolved. The rumours of an affair between Eleanor and her uncle Raymond of Antioch circulating in her own lifetime, the marriage's eventual annulment in 1152 on grounds of consanguinity, the specific political dynamic of a man who was deeply pious and somewhat timid, and a woman who was brilliant and entirely comfortable with power. 2 months after the annulment, she married Henry, who was 11 years her junior, and between them they produced 8 children and an empire. The children, the ones who survived, defined English and continental European politics for a generation. The eldest surviving son, Henry the young king, was crowned co-ruler in 1170 to secure the succession, then spent his short life in furious resentment at the co-kingship that gave him the title without the substance. Geoffrey was given Brittany and spent his adult years scheming against his father and brother. John, later King John, the least popular monarch in English history, the king whose barons forced the signing of Magna Carta, was the youngest and apparently Henry's favourite, which is one of those parental preferences whose consequences are almost always disastrous. And then there was Richard. Richard was the third son, born in Oxford in September 1157, who from early childhood lived most of his life in his mother's Duchy of Aquitaine rather than in England. Eleanor's relationship with Henry had deteriorated from its early passionate intensity into a complex mixture of political partnership and personal hostility, and she retreated to her southern French territories with Richard in a way that made him, more than any of his brothers, specifically her son, the inheritor of her southern French culture, her troubadour sensibility, her specific love of poetry and music, and the elaborate aesthetic world of the courts of Poitou and Aquitaine. Richard was given the Duchy of Aquitaine at age 11, formally invested in it at 14, and spent the following decade governing it and fighting its rebellious barons with a ferocity and a skill that established his military reputation across France before most of his contemporaries had fought their first significant battle. The specific character of Aquitaine, the vast, wealthy, culturally sophisticated duchy that Eleanor had brought into the marriage, and that Richard governed from his early teens, shaped him as profoundly as the Agog shaped a Spartan. Aquitaine was not England. It was one of the most culturally refined regions of medieval Europe, the heartland of the troubadour tradition, the place where the specific aesthetic culture of courtly love, the poetry and music and elaborate social rituals of the Occitan-speaking southern French aristocracy had its deepest roots. The court of Eleanor's grandfather, William Nide of Aquitaine, had been one of the earliest centres of troubadour activity. Eleanor herself was a patron of poets and musicians of genuine sophistication, and she had raised Richard in an environment where musical and poetic accomplishment were not ornamental but central to the social world of the southern French nobility. Richard wrote poetry. This is not a biographical footnote or a surprising fact about a famous warrior. It was a central feature of his self-understanding and his public identity. 2 poems attributed to him survive: a Sivent in Occitan complaining about his captivity in Germany, and a French-language poem also about his captivity. Both are accomplished examples of their genres, not great poetry by the standards of the best troubadour composers, but genuine poetry with real, formal command, not the amateur versification of a man who happened to be a king. This event specifically demonstrates familiarity with the technical conventions of the form and an ability to use those conventions for personal emotional expression that goes beyond mere competence. Richard composed in prison. He sang in prison. Whatever else he was losing, his kingdom, his health, his political position, he did not lose the cultural identity that his mother had given him. The governing of Aquitaine was neither easy nor peaceful. The duchy's barons were notoriously independent, their castles the anchors of local power that resisted any central authority with the automatic self-interest of people who had found that resistance was consistently profitable. Richard spent the years between his formal investiture at 14 and his accession to the English throne at 31 in a more or less continuous military engagement with the rebellious lords of Aquitaine and neighbouring Gascony, developing in the process an expertise in siege warfare and mobile campaigning that had no equal among the contemporary commanders of northern France or England. The taking of the supposedly impregnable fortress of Taillebourg on the Charente River in 1139 made his reputation across Europe and established the template of the subsequent career. The castle everyone said couldn't be taken, analysed for its specific vulnerabilities, approached in the way that the conventional military wisdom said was impossible, taken. He did this repeatedly, and the repetition of the pattern was itself a kind of military argument, a demonstration that what was called impregnable was actually merely challenging to someone willing to think differently about it. By the time Richard went to the Holy Land, he had been governing and fighting for nearly 2 decades. He was 33 years old, and he had more practical experience of command in difficult terrain against motivated opponents than any comparable figure in European military life. The Crusade did not teach him to be a commander. It gave his existing command gifts a stage of extraordinary scale and historical consequence. The specific dynastic arrangements that Henry made for his sons were the product of a calculation that might have been sensible in theory and proved catastrophic in practice. He wanted to secure the succession and establish his sons in their respective territories before his own death, but he could not bring himself to actually hand over authority to the sons he was ostensibly establishing. The young king rebelled. Richard rebelled alongside him. Their younger brother Geoffrey joined the rebellion. Eleanor, imprisoned by Henry for the rest of his reign, after being caught apparently trying to flee to France to join her sons, was the acknowledged organising intelligence behind the various familial conflicts that consumed the 1170s and 1180s. Henry II spent the last 15 years of his reign fighting his own family, winning individual confrontations and losing the war of attrition. His sons came back to him, asked forgiveness, received it, and then rebelled again. A pattern that Henry's suspicious nature and his inability to share actual authority made essentially inevitable. Richard was both his father's most capable opponent and his most complicated relationship. Unlike the young king, who wanted power without having earned it, Richard wanted Aquitaine, his territory, his inheritance, the thing he had actually governed and fought for, to remain his regardless of what Henry decided to do with the succession overall. The specific conflict of 1189 was over Henry's plan to give Aquitaine to John as part of a new territorial arrangement, which Richard refused. He allied with Philip II of France, marched against his dying father, and chased the old man from fortress to fortress through the Loire Valley, until Henry, already dying of a fever that the stress and exhaustion had made lethal, agreed to the terms Richard and Philip demanded. He died at Chinon on July 6, 1189, in the middle of the summer heat, and the specific circumstances of his last hours are one of the most humanly painful episodes in the history of the Plantagenet dynasty. Alone except for a few servants, his legitimate sons gone over to the enemy, learning from a messenger that John, his favourite, the son he had tried to protect, had joined the rebellion at the end. Richard came to Chinon after his father's death and stood for a long time by the body. What he felt there is not recorded in the sources with any specificity, because the medieval chronicle tradition was not interested in the interior, emotional lives of its subjects in the way that modern biography would be. What is clear is that he carried for the rest of his life something complicated about the way Henry died. A guilt that expressed itself in various acts of piety toward his father's memory, and in the specific arrangement of his own burial at Henry's feet at Fontevraud. Richard became King of England on Henry's death in July 1189. His coronation at Westminster Abbey in September of that year was one of the great events of the medieval ceremonial calendar, a performance of royal power and wealth and religious legitimacy in which the newly minted king demonstrated for the benefit of every significant power in European politics that the transition of authority had been smooth and that the Plantagenet Empire was in competent hands. Then he started selling things. But before the fundraising and preparation for the Crusade, there was one event at the coronation and its aftermath that belongs in any honest account of Richard's early reign: the pogroms. The coronation of September 3, 1189, was accompanied by the systematic massacre of a significant portion of London's Jewish community, followed by similar violence in several other English cities. The immediate precipitant was a riot at the coronation banquet from which Jews and women had been excluded. A small group of Jewish representatives who came to present gifts was attacked by a crowd who interpreted, or claimed to interpret, their presence as a violation of the exclusion order. The violence that began at the banquet spread to the city, where Jewish homes were attacked and burned, and Jews were killed in numbers that the sources record imprecisely but clearly describe as substantial. Richard was furious when he heard what had happened. He issued writs forbidding the persecution of Jews and executed 3 of the ringleaders of the riot. The executions were not purely principled. 2 of the 3 who were executed were apparently Christians who'd been caught in the violence, which suggests the exemplary punishment was partly about maintaining order rather than purely protecting the Jewish population. But the anger was real, and the writs were genuine efforts to prevent further violence. They did not prevent further violence. In March 1190 in York, a larger massacre occurred. The Jewish community of York, threatened by a mob, took refuge in the royal castle of Clifford's Tower. When it became clear that the castle could not be held, many of the Jewish community inside chose to die by their own hands rather than be killed by the mob. A collective act of suicide that the chronicler William of Newburgh described with evident horror. Those who surrendered were killed anyway. The York Massacre was the worst episode of anti-Jewish violence in medieval English history to that point, and it was partly motivated by the calculation that the debts owed to Jewish creditors would be cancelled by the creditors' deaths. Richard's fundraising for the Crusade had increased pressure on his subjects at all levels of the economic hierarchy, and the Jewish community, who occupied the specific economic niche of money lending that canonical law forbade Christians and whose prosperity was therefore both essential to the medieval economy and deeply resented, were the visible symbol of financial obligation in ways that the social tensions of a taxation-heavy moment made dangerous. Richard bore no direct responsibility for the York Massacre, but the political and fiscal climate his Crusade fundraising created contributed to the conditions in which it occurred, and the fact that he was preparing to leave England for 3 years without leaving adequate mechanisms for protecting the Jewish community that his predecessors had granted royal protection, was a failure of governance whose consequences were immediate and severe. Then he started selling things. The preparation for the Crusade that had been his consuming ambition since taking the vow in 1187, when news of Saladin's capture of Jerusalem had spread across Christendom, and Richard had sworn, along with hundreds of other knights and lords, to take the cross and recover the Holy City, began immediately after the coronation with a frantic efficiency that contemporaries found alternately admirable and alarming. He raised money by selling offices, rights and privileges with a thoroughness that left the structures of English governance essentially intact, which was the crucial point. He was not dismantling the state, but monetizing its appointments, and the structures themselves continued to function under the men who had purchased the positions. He was reputed to have said that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer, which is probably an invention but captures the spirit of the enterprise accurately. To understand why Jerusalem mattered enough to Richard and to the entire Christian world of his period to justify this scale of effort and expense, you have to understand both what the city meant to 12th century Catholic Christianity and what had happened there in the century since the First Crusade. The Kingdom of Jerusalem that existed in the century between its founding in 1099 and its near destruction at Hattin in 1187 was a more complex and pragmatic entity than the popular image of fanatical crusaders suggests. The men who governed it adapted to the specific social and political realities of the Levant with considerable pragmatism. They developed working relationships with Muslim neighbours when those relationships served their interests. They hired Muslim soldiers and administrators. They absorbed elements of Byzantine and Arab administrative practice. The military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, were the backbone of the kingdom's permanent military capacity, monastic warrior monks who combined the vows of poverty, chastity and obedience with the practice of professional warfare, maintaining the frontier castles and providing the heavy cavalry that Crusader military operations required. The First Crusade of 1096 to 1099 had captured Jerusalem in a siege that ended in a massacre so complete that the chroniclers described blood running in the streets of the city, and had established a series of Crusader states along the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, the County of Tripoli, that the Crusaders called Outremer, literally beyond the sea. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was a genuinely remarkable political achievement, a European-style feudal kingdom in the Levant, governing a mixed population of Christians, Muslims and Jews under a system of laws and institutions that adapted to the specific social realities of its situation with considerable pragmatism. Its fall to Saladin in 1187 was a theological and civilizational crisis whose depth modern secular readers find difficult to fully imagine, but that was entirely genuine in its emotional and spiritual weight. Jerusalem was not merely a city with strategic importance, it was the city where Christ has died and risen, the physical centre of the faith that organised medieval European civilization's entire understanding of time and meaning and destiny. Its loss was experienced as something close to the end of the world. Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was the man who had made Richard's crusade necessary, and understanding him is as essential to understanding the Third Crusade as understanding Richard himself. He had been born around 1137 in Tikrit in what is now Iraq, the son of a Kurdish military commander. He grew up in Damascus, entered the military service of his uncle Shirkuh, and by a combination of military success and political intelligence, had made himself the effective ruler of Egypt by 1169 and the Sultan of Egypt and Syria by 1174. What he then accomplished over the following decade was one of the more remarkable political achievements of the medieval Middle East, the unification, under Ayyubid leadership, of Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Hejaz into a political entity, capable of sustained military and diplomatic pressure against the Crusader states. The unity was achieved through a combination of genuine military force and the specific legitimizing power of the jihad narrative. Saladin positioned himself as the champion of Sunni Islamic orthodoxy against both the Shiite Fatimid legacy he had displaced in Egypt and the Crusader presence in the Levant, and the narrative was credible because his conduct in power supported it. The Battle of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, was the military masterpiece that made everything else possible. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had been in political crisis for years. The leper king Baldwin IV, who had governed with extraordinary personal courage while leprosy progressively consumed him, had died in 1185, and the succession had passed through his young nephew and then to Guy de Lusignan, a man of limited political and military ability who was king by virtue of his marriage to Baldwin's sister Sibylla. The most aggressive faction of the Crusader nobility, dominated by Reynold of Chatillon, had been provoking Saladin with broken truces and caravan raids, and Reynold's final provocation, the seizure of a major Muslim caravan that may have included members of Saladin's family, gave Saladin both the justification and the necessity for a decisive campaign. He positioned his forces between the Crusader army's camp at Sepphoris and the besieged city of Tiberias, and waited for Guy de Lusignan to make the decision that military logic advised against, marching his full army across a waterless plateau on a summer day to relieve Tiberias. Guy, under pressure from Reynold and the Templars, made exactly that decision. The Crusader army was harassed by Saladin's cavalry throughout the march, unable to reach water, unable to maintain formation under the conditions, and by the time it reached the plateau of Hattin, it was a force of dehydrated, exhausted men encircled by fresh cavalry. The battle was decided as much by thirst as by fighting. The true cross was captured. Guy de Lusignan was taken prisoner. Reynald of Chatillon was executed by Saladin personally, the only prisoner he killed at Hattin, a deliberate act of justice for the caravan raid. Within months, Jerusalem fell. Saladin's entry into Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187, was conducted with a deliberate restraint that stood in explicit contrast to the massacre of 1099. He did not permit the sack of the city. He negotiated ransom terms for the Crusader population. He released many who could not pay their ransoms from his own funds. The specific image of Saladin as the noble, magnanimous Muslim leader, an image that shaped European perceptions throughout the medieval period and remains dominant today, was substantially constructed by this conduct, which Saladin understood as a demonstration of Islamic virtue as well as a genuine expression of his character. He was a man of real religious conviction who believed that his conduct in victory was as important to the religious legitimacy of his project as his conduct in battle. Richard heard the news of Jerusalem's fall in the late autumn of 1187 and took the cross immediately. He was 30 years old, Duke of Aquitaine and heir to his father's throne, and the vow he made was not a political calculation but what appears from all available evidence to have been a genuine personal commitment, the specific expression of the crusading ideology in a man who had the physical and military gifts to actually do what the ideology demanded. The Third Crusade assembled with difficulty. Frederick Barbarossa drowned in a river in Cilicia in June 1190, dissolving the German crusading effort almost entirely. Philip II of France and Richard left Europe separately in the summer of 1190, conducting their alliance with the mutual suspicion of men who had fought each other for territory and who were now obligated to cooperate for a religious cause they both took seriously and whose military implications they calculated differently. Philip was a different kind of intelligence from Richard, patient, strategic, politically calculating, not particularly martial in the personal sense. He wanted Jerusalem recovered and wanted to be seen to have contributed to recovering it. He also wanted to keep his army intact, not exhaust his resources, and maintain his position to take advantage of whatever opportunities Richard's absence from England and France created. These motivations were not hypocritical in any simple sense. The Crusading ideology accommodated political calculation alongside religious devotion, as it had always done. But they produced a Philip who was always looking for the right moment to return home, which arrived for him after the fall of Acre in August 1191. Richard's route to the Holy Land generated episodes that reveal his character's range. In Cyprus in May 1191, his fleet encountered the island's Byzantine lord Isaac Komnenos, who had taken prisoners from two of Richard's ships that had been driven ashore by storms, including the ship carrying his betrothed Berengaria and his sister Joan. Richard's response was to conquer the island in 3 weeks. The Cyprus campaign was fast, efficient, and entirely outside the scope of the crusade he had sworn to conduct. But it was also strategically significant. Cyprus became the primary logistical base for the Crusader state's remaining century of existence, its agricultural resources and ports supplying what the mainland could not. He also married Berengaria in Cyprus, in a ceremony of May 1191 that the sources describe briefly. The marriage was arranged partly for strategic reasons. Navarre's alliance was geopolitically useful, and partly because the long-standing betrothal to Alice of France had to be broken and replaced. Alice was Philip's sister, and the betrothal had been maintained through years of diplomatic awkwardness by a persistent rumour, which Richard deployed as his pretext for breaking it, that Henry II had taken Alice as his mistress. Whether the rumour was true is not established. That Richard used it effectively is clear. The siege of Acre, when Richard arrived in June 1191, had been ongoing for nearly 2 years in a situation of extraordinary complexity. Crusader forces besieging the city while Saladin's army besieged the besiegers, a triple-layered tactical situation that was consuming men and materials without resolution. Richard's arrival with his fleet and his army, combined with Philip's French forces already present, broke the deadlock. The garrison negotiated a surrender on July 12, 1191, on terms that specified the lives of the garrison would be spared in exchange for a substantial ransom, the release of Christian prisoners, and the return of the True Cross. Then, on August 20th, 1191, Richard ordered the execution of approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners. The specific context matters for understanding the decision, though it does not excuse it. The surrender terms negotiated when the garrison capitulated had specified that their lives would be spared in exchange for the True Cross, the release of a specified number of Christian prisoners held by Saladin, and a cash payment of 200,000 dinars. The terms were agreed, the garrison surrendered on their basis. What followed was a 6-week period of negotiation over the specific fulfillment of the terms, during which Saladin was genuinely attempting to produce the Christian prisoners and the payment, but was struggling with the logistical and financial demands involved. Richard set a deadline. The deadline passed without the full delivery. He concluded that the agreement was not going to be honoured in the time frame his military planning required. The military logic was real. The army needed to march south before the summer heat became more severe, Saladin's harassment of a stationary force was mounting, and maintaining 2,700 prisoners on the march was a logistical burden that consumed men and resources he could not spare. None of this constitutes a moral justification. The prisoners had surrendered on guaranteed terms. Executing them violated those terms. It was a war crime by any standard that recognizes the binding nature of surrender agreements, and the Muslim chroniclers who recorded it, who had been writing with admiring objectivity about Richard's military conduct throughout the campaign, shifted into a different register entirely when they described the massacre. Their horror is the most credible testimony to what the act was. The decision was made in cold calculation, not in the heat of battle. The negotiations over the surrender terms had been ongoing through July and August, with Saladin genuinely attempting to fulfill the agreement, but struggling to produce the promised ransom and prisoners on Richard's schedule. Richard concluded that holding 2,700 prisoners while marching south toward Jerusalem was a logistical burden he could not carry, that the agreement was not going to be honoured in the time frame his military situation required, and that the prisoners had to die. The killing was carried out on the road outside Acre, in full view of Saladin's forces watching from the hills. Saladin was furious, outraged in ways that the sources on both sides record, and his immediate impulse was to execute the Christian prisoners in his custody. He was talked out of or moderated in this by his advisers, though Christians in his hands did subsequently face harder treatment. The moral weight of what Richard ordered at Acre is not diminished by military calculation, and the legend that has celebrated Richard as the embodiment of chivalric virtue has consistently struggled with this fact. The massacre was real. It was a deliberate decision by a commander who was simultaneously capable of extraordinary mercy. He would pardon the boy who shot him at Chalus, and of this, both Richard existed. The legend prefers one, the history requires both. The march from Acre south to Jaffa in August 1191 is one of the most impressive sustained military operations of the medieval period. Saladin, having concluded after Acre that open battle on favourable terms was not consistently achievable against Richard's army, chose the strategy of harassing the marching column, striking with cavalry at the flanks and rear to break formation, exhaust the men, and prevent the Crusaders from reaching Jaffa with their force intact. Richard designed his response to this strategy with a systematic intelligence that the Muslim chroniclers noticed and recorded with frank admiration. He put his infantry on the seaward flank to protect the cavalry from direct assault, stationed his crossbowmen as a mobile screen walking backward so they could fire outward as the column moved forward, kept his fleet parallel on the water to provide supplies and the option of retreat, and issued strict orders against the cavalry charge that Saladin's harassment was designed to provoke. For days the column moved under constant attack, absorbing arrows, losing men and horses, maintaining its discipline in the specific way that only a force that genuinely trusted its commander could maintain. Baha'u'ddin ibn Shaddad, the Muslim chronicler who was present in Saladin's camp, and whose account of the campaign is one of our most valuable sources, described the marching crusaders with undisguised astonishment. Men walking through continuous arrow fire without breaking formation, crossbowmen maintaining their fire discipline under conditions specifically designed to break it. He noted that he observed Crusader soldiers with so many arrows in their padded outer garments that they resembled hedgehogs. The arrows caught in the quilting without reaching flesh. The discipline he was recording was partly the result of Richard's specific organisational arrangements and partly the product of men who had followed this commander to Palestine and trusted his judgment in ways that overrode their individual instinct for flight. The Battle of Arsuf on September 7th, 1191, was the climax of the march and the most purely military demonstration of Richard's tactical genius. At a moment determined by Saladin rather than by Richard's plan, the Hospitallers at the rearguard, who'd been absorbing some of the heaviest punishment all day, broke. 2 knights charged without orders. Richard's whole scheme required a coordinated charge at the right moment. 2 knights charging without orders could have been a catastrophe. Instead, Richard made the instant decision to commit the full cavalry before the break could be exploited, sounding the charge across the army and converting a near crisis into the decisive blow. Saladin's forces were driven from the field. He never again sought pitched battle against Richard. Arsuf secured Jaffa, which became the operational base for the campaign toward Jerusalem. What followed across the autumn of 1191 and into 1192 was the period of strategic frustration that the legend has converted into tragedy. Richard twice approached Jerusalem and twice turned back. He came within sight of the city in December 1191 and again in June 1192. Both times his war council advised withdrawal, for reasons that the military professionals in the council articulated in terms that Richard, the military professional, understood and ultimately accepted. The army was not large enough to simultaneously besiege Jerusalem and protect its supply lines from Saladin's forces. Even if the siege succeeded, the garrison left to defend it would be isolated and vulnerable. The First Crusade had captured Jerusalem, but the subsequent defence of an isolated interior city had nearly bankrupted the Crusader states repeatedly. Richard's army, if it took Jerusalem, would then immediately face the same problem. What the legend does not adequately capture is the emotional cost of these decisions. Richard had taken the cross. He had sworn before God to recover the holy city. He had spent 2 years preparing, voyaged across the Mediterranean, fought his way down the coast of Palestine, won the most impressive series of military engagements in the history of the Crusades, and he turned back. Twice, within sight of the thing he had come for. The available evidence suggests he understood, as clearly as anyone in the field, why he was right to turn back, and that the understanding did not make the decision easier. The political situation in the Crusading coalition was making everything harder. Philip had returned to France in August 1191, taking French forces and leaving Richard in command of an increasingly fractious coalition whose internal politics consumed energy that the military situation required. The question of who would be king of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan, the current king, against Conrad of Montferrat, whose ability was generally acknowledged to exceed Guy's, was argued in councils that Richard had to manage while simultaneously planning military operations. He eventually supported Conrad, the council elected Conrad, and then Conrad was assassinated by assassins 2 days after his election, stabbed in the streets of Tyre by 2 men who had spent weeks cultivating his confidence, in one of those medieval political murders whose causal chain the sources obscure, and which historians have attributed to various parties without achieving consensus. Through all of this, Richard was in communication with Saladin and Saladin's brother Aladil, negotiations conducted partly through formal intermediaries and partly through exchanges that had a quality of genuine personal engagement that the chronicle sources preserve with evident wonder. Richard proposed at one point that Aladil marry his sister Joan and rule Jerusalem jointly with her, a proposal whose creative diplomacy was more interesting than its practical likelihood, and which Joan reportedly rejected flatly when asked. Whether Richard intended this seriously or as a negotiating probe is contested by historians. What is clear is that neither side found the exchange offensive or bizarre, which tells you something about the specific atmosphere of the negotiations between 2 commanders who have been trying to destroy each other's armies for 2 years. and who had come to something approaching genuine mutual respect. The famous anecdote of Saladin sending Richard fresh fruit and snow during his illness is documented from multiple sources and fits within a broader pattern of exchange between the two commanders that the chronicles preserve with evident wonder and occasional bewilderment. Two men trying to destroy each other's armies, maintaining what can only be described as chivalric courtesy toward each other across the lines of a war neither was willing to conclude through negotiation at that stage, exchanging gifts and messages through intermediaries while simultaneously planning each other's military defeat. The medieval chroniclers preserved these exchanges partly because they fit the chivalric ideal of noble enmity, the idea that the truly great warrior respected the equally great warrior who opposed him, and partly because the exchanges were simply remarkable in themselves, the kind of thing that happens when two people of unusual quality find themselves in a situation that forces them into direct, extended, high-stakes contact. The negotiations that Richard conducted with Saladin's brother Aladil through the latter part of 1191 and into 1192 are among the most extraordinary diplomatic exchanges of the medieval period. Richard proposed at various points that Aladil marry his sister Joan and rule Jerusalem jointly with her as a couple acceptable to both Muslim and Christian constituencies, that Richard himself might convert to Islam. Whether this was a genuine proposal or a diplomatic gambit is not clear from the sources, that various territorial arrangements might be constructed that would give Christians access to Jerusalem without requiring Muslim surrender of the city. None of these proposals came to anything, but the fact that they were made and that Saladin engaged with them seriously enough to relay them to his own council suggests that both men were sufficiently pragmatic to consider solutions that their respective political and religious constituencies would have found problematic. The broader pattern. When Richard charged into the relief of Jaffa in August 1192, wading ashore from a ship into a fight against vastly superior numbers in what several chroniclers suggest was tactically mad and personally reckless, and converted potential disaster into another improbable victory, Saladin reportedly sent a horse to Richard after Richard's own was killed, because a commander of that quality fighting on foot was beneath the dignity of the occasion. The gesture is documented. It was the act of a man who was capable of seeing his enemy clearly, and who found in the clarity not contempt but something closer to admiration. The Treaty of September 2nd, 1192, gave the Crusade what could be salvaged. The coast from Tyre to Jaffa remained in Christian hands. Ascalon was demolished, its fortifications torn down, a significant concession from Richard that the military situation required and that he had argued against. Christian pilgrims would have free access to Jerusalem and the holy sites. The 3-year truce gave the Crusader states breathing space they used well, and the kingdom survived for nearly another century. Whether the treaty was a success or a failure has been argued for 8 centuries. The answer depends entirely on what you think was achievable, given the specific conditions of the campaign and the forces available to each side. Richard sailed from Acre on October 9th, 1192. Toward a home that had been in political crisis for most of his absence. But before we follow him into captivity, it is worth pausing on the sheer physical achievement of what he had spent the previous 2.5 years doing, because the popular image of crusading knights as heroic figures riding through the Holy Land tends to obscure the grinding physical reality of what crusading actually involved. Richard had left England in June 1190. He arrived in the Holy Land in June 1191. The year in between was not rest or preparation. It was a continuous logistical operation of moving an army and a fleet of hundreds of ships across the Mediterranean while managing the political crises generated by Sicily and Cyprus, and the dynastic complications of Berengaria, and the ongoing negotiations with Philip II about the French territories. The campaign in Palestine itself, from June 1191 to October 1192, was 16 months of military operations in conditions of extreme heat and supply difficulty against an opponent who never stopped moving and who used the landscape and the climate as weapons as effectively as any army Richard faced. The distances were enormous. The march from Acre to Jaffa was approximately 60 miles along the coast, and it took nearly a month because of the pace that Saladin's harassment imposed. The advance toward Jerusalem and back, twice, covered hundreds of miles in the summer heat of the Palestinian interior. Richard reportedly fell ill multiple times during the campaign. The accounts of his illness at various points are consistent with the pattern of fevers and infections that the Levantine climate produced in European armies of the period, and that had killed Frederick Barbarossa and would kill many others. He conducted military operations while sick, recovered, resumed the march, fell ill again. The physical demands of the campaign were such that the army he had brought was substantially reduced in effective strength by its end, not primarily through battle casualties but through disease, desertion, and the gradual attrition of men who had simply spent too many months in conditions that their bodies were not designed to sustain. Richard sustained it. This specific combination of physical constitution, psychological resilience, and the driven quality of a man who had made a vow to God and intended to honour it as fully as circumstances allowed, kept him functional through conditions that reduced his army and may have contributed to the death of his great opponent. He left Palestine having not recovered Jerusalem. He left it having preserved the Crusader coast, having created the conditions for the kingdom's survival, and having demonstrated on the field of battle at Arsuf and Jaffa something that his enemies acknowledged, that he was the finest military commander in the medieval world at that moment. Richard sailed from Acre on October 9th, 1192, toward a home that had been in political crisis for most of his absence. He never returned to the Holy Land. He never saw Jerusalem. Saladin died the following March of a fever, the coins in his treasury reportedly insufficient to pay for the copper basin used to wash his body. The two greatest commanders of the Third Crusade both left the Holy Land without achieving the goals they had set out for. History was doing what history does when two genuinely extraordinary people collide, producing an outcome that neither of them designed. The voyage home became, improbably and in the most operationally frustrating way possible, the next chapter of the legend. Richard understood that he had made enemies along the way, and that the overland routes through Central Europe were dangerous. He attempted a disguise. The disguise failed. In December 1192, near Vienna, he was recognized and taken by the forces of Leopold, Duke of Austria, the same Leopold whose banner Richard had reportedly thrown into a ditch at Acre, the same insult in the same story that medieval chroniclers found either characteristically Richardine or characteristically catastrophic depending on their sympathies. Leopold handed him over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who had independent grievances. Richard had supported Tancred of Sicily against Henry's claims to the island, and Richard's nephews were entangled in German succession politics that Henry found threatening. Henry kept Richard imprisoned at Dürnstein Castle on the Danube and subsequently at other imperial fortresses, and began negotiating the ransom that would establish his profit and demonstrate his power. The ransom eventually set was 150,000 marks of silver, a figure approximately 2 to 3 times the entire annual revenue of the English crown. The two poems that survive from Richard are among the few documents in which his voice comes through in something like a direct register. The Cervantes he wrote during his captivity, sometimes called Janus Hompres, is a song of complaint and accusation addressed to his subjects and allies, asking why they have left him to languish in prison when a man of his standing and his deeds should have been ransomed promptly. The tone combines genuine indignation with the formal conventions of the Cervantes genre, and the emotional content, the king humiliated by captivity, the warrior made helpless, comes through the formal structures with real force. He was not writing diplomatically. He was writing as a man who felt abandoned. The poem was circulated, apparently in the hope that shame and obligation would accelerate the ransom, and it was preserved because the literary community of the period valued it as genuine poetry, not merely as a king's complaint. Richard's captivity generated, within years or decades of the event, one of the most charming and almost certainly fictional stories in medieval romance. Blondel the troubadour, Richard's companion and fellow musician, wandering Europe singing a song only Richard knew, eventually hearing the imprisoned king's voice completing the melody from behind castle walls. The story is first recorded in the 13th century, well after Richard's death, and most historians treat it as legend. But legends exist because they say something true about their subjects, and the image of the poet king identified by his music rather than his face captures something real about the Richard who wrote prison poetry in Occitan, and who inhabited both the warrior's world and the troubadour's world with genuine, not merely strategic, commitment. While Richard was imprisoned, the political situation in England and France was deteriorating in ways that his captors, and Philip and John, were actively encouraging. Philip II of France had concluded a tacit alliance with John, Richard's brother, who occupied Windsor Castle and made various preparations for seizing power that might or might not have amounted to serious rebellion, depending on which source you read. Philip attempted to bribe Henry VI with an offer of substantial payment to keep Richard imprisoned longer or hand him over to France. Henry turned the offer down, partly because Richard's ransom was more money than Philip was offering, and partly because Richard had, during his captivity, impressed the German court sufficiently that a powerful faction of German princes favoured his release. Eleanor of Aquitaine, in her late 60s, managed the crisis of the ransom with the same formidable competence she had brought to every political challenge of her remarkable life. She organised the taxation, clergy and laymen taxed for a quarter of their property, church treasures confiscated, every available fiscal mechanism deployed, oversaw the collection, and eventually brought the ransom payment to Germany herself, accompanying Richard from his captivity to his freedom. The image of the old queen coming to Germany to bring her son home is one of the genuinely moving episodes of a life that was already one of the most dramatic in medieval history. Richard was released in February 1194. But what had happened in England and in France during his 15 months of captivity is worth tracing in some detail, because it reveals both the resilience of the administrative structures that Henry II had built and the specific political crisis that Richard's absence had created. England, in Richard's absence, had been governed primarily by two justiciars, the senior royal administrators who acted as vice-regents when the king was away, and by Eleanor, who had returned to active political life after Richard's accession, with an energy and a competence that astonished contemporaries who might have expected an old woman of nearly 70 to be content with retirement. She had spent 16 years imprisoned by her husband. She had watched 3 of her sons die. She had managed the complex political aftermath of Henry's death and Richard's accession. Now she threw herself into the crisis of the ransom with the organisational capacity that had characterised her entire life. The taxation required to raise 150,000 marks was unprecedented in its scope and its burden. The entire kingdom was taxed. Clergy and laymen alike paid a quarter of the value of their movable property, a rate of taxation that had no parallel in the prior administrative history of England. Church treasures were confiscated. The gold and silver vessels that monasteries and cathedrals had accumulated over centuries melted down or pledged against the ransom. Knights paid scutage, a payment in lieu of military service. Landholders paid carucage, a tax on arable land. The wool from the Cistercian monasteries, the great English wool-producing establishments whose fleeces were the most valuable agricultural commodity in the medieval English economy, was collected directly for the ransom. The total raised was enormous. The process was conducted with remarkable administrative efficiency, and the burden it placed on every level of English society was real and resented. John, meanwhile, was conducting a politics of opportunism that he later had sufficient cause to regret. He allied with Philip II of France, took control of various royal castles, and attempted to position himself as the alternative centre of authority in England, not quite declaring rebellion, not quite loyal either, occupying the ambiguous space that the medieval political culture allowed between outright treason and acceptable political positioning. Philip from France was doing the same in the continental territories, attempting to extract territorial concessions from John in exchange for French recognition of his claim to be Richard's successor, seizing Norman castles, building the political and military position that he had been preparing for throughout the period of the Crusade. Eleanor held England together. This is not a metaphorical statement. She moved around the country, appeared at councils, had oaths of loyalty administered or re-administered to the barons, reinforced garrisons in strategically important castles, and simply by her presence and her authority prevented the political unravelling that John and Philip were both working toward. Her relationship with John during this period had the quality of a mother managing a difficult adolescent rather than a political rival. She understood that John would become Richard's successor if Richard died, and that a permanent rupture between the brothers was in no one's interest, and she treated his manoeuvring with the combination of firmness and flexible management that the situation required. The moment of Richard's release was described by Philip to John in a message that has become one of the most quoted dispatches in medieval history. "Look to yourself, the devil is loosed." The message captured accurately what Philip understood about what Richard's release meant for the political position they had both been building during the captivity. Philip knew, perhaps better than anyone, what Richard was capable of, and what Richard returning to his French territories with the fury of a man who had been imprisoned and whose lands had been raided during his absence would look like in the field. Richard was released in February 1194, after 14 months of captivity that had produced, alongside the political crisis, a genuine cultural engagement that the chronicle accounts tend to obscure. The formal hearing at Speyer in March 1193, at which the charges against him were laid before Henry VI and the assembled German princes, became a demonstration of Richard's extraordinary rhetorical capacity. He defended himself in Latin with a fluency and elegance that the assembled court found remarkable, turning what was designed as a humiliation into a performance of royal dignity. The English chronicler Roger of Hoveden describes the German princes weeping as Richard spoke. Whether this specific detail is accurate, the underlying claim that Richard won over the German court through the force of his personality is consistent across multiple sources. He arrived in England in March, his second visit to the country he had ruled for 5 years. He held a crown-wearing ceremony at Winchester, the formal public display of the king in full regalia, the demonstration that captivity and ransom had not broken him or diminished his majesty, and then returned to France to attend to the business that was most urgent from his perspective, recovering the territories Philip had seized during his absence. The last 5 years of Richard's reign, 1194 to 1190, are the period that the legend most consistently neglects, and in some ways they are the most revealing. They are the years when the legendary Crusader became something that his legend has not quite accommodated, an exceptionally capable king of the Angevin territories in France, fighting a systematic and largely successful campaign to recover what Philip had taken and to rebuild the Plantagenet position in its French heartland. Philip had used Richard's years of absence with considerable skill, but the rivalry between Richard and Philip deserves more than the treatment it gets as a subplot to the Crusade and the captivity, because it was itself one of the central political stories of late 12th century Europe, and its outcome would determine whether the Angevin Empire survived or dissolved. The structural problem was simple and had no clean solution. Richard, as King of England and Duke of Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and associated territories, was simultaneously one of the most powerful rulers in Europe and the feudal vassal of the King of France for his French territories. He owed homage to Philip for those territories. The obligation was ancient, established in the feudal arrangements that governed the relationship between the French crown and the great noble families that held land in the royal domain. Philip had every right, under the feudal law that everyone acknowledged, to demand that Richard perform the acts of submission that vassalage required. Richard had every incentive, as a ruler of roughly comparable power to Philip, and in many respects greater actual military capacity, to resist those demands in practice while acknowledging them in principle. The gap between the formal feudal relationship and the actual power relationship was one that Philip dedicated his long reign to closing, and that Richard and his successors spent their reigns trying to prevent him from closing. Philip's specific genius was patience combined with intelligence. He could wait for opportunities and exploit them decisively when they came. He had waited through the Crusade, building his position quietly. He had tried to exploit Richard's captivity and been frustrated by Eleanor's management of England, and by the German prince's reluctance to cooperate indefinitely. He had taken what he could in Normandy while Richard was away. When Richard returned and Philip sent him the famous message about the devil being loosed, he was demonstrating that he understood exactly what the returning king represented. A military operator who was better than he was in the field, who would now have the resources and the motivation to reverse everything Philip had built during the captivity period. The War of 1194 to 1199 was, from Richard's perspective, not a war of revenge but a war of strategic recovery. The systematic recapture of the castles and territories that Philip had taken, the rebuilding of the defensive architecture of the Norman borderlands, the reassertion of the Angevin position that had been established by Henry II and that had been eroding throughout the period of Richard's absence. The pace and effectiveness of this recovery astonished contemporaries and deeply alarmed Philip, who had built his gains carefully over years and watched Richard reverse them in months. The specific military dynamic of the 1190s war between Richard and Philip was one in which Richard consistently outmoved and outfought his opponent, taking positions before they could be reinforced, conducting sieges with the speed and tactical sophistication that Philip's more methodical approach could not match. Philip had used Richard's years of absence with considerable skill, extracting territorial concessions through negotiation and alliance with John, building a French baronial coalition that posed a genuine long-term threat to the Plantagenet position. The war Richard fought from 1194 to 1199 was a different kind of war from the Crusade, not the grand chivalric enterprise of the Holy Land, but the grinding, technically sophisticated business of castle warfare in the Norman borderlands. Richard was very good at this. His earlier reputation for taking supposedly impregnable fortresses was sustained and extended through the 1190s, and the specific skill he brought to siege warfare, the engineering intelligence that identified a fortification's vulnerabilities and designed approaches that conventional methodology missed, was as remarkable in France as it had been in Palestine. The great architectural statement of these years was Château Gaillard, the castle Richard built on the Seine at Les Andelys in approximately 2 years, completed around 1198. The castle's innovative concentric design, its specific use of the river bluff's topography, and its integration of the most advanced military architecture of the period into a single coherent defensive system represented a genuine contribution to the history of military engineering. Philip, who came to view it during construction, was reportedly both impressed and alarmed, a reaction the castle was partly designed to produce. Its ruins survive above the Seine, still visually striking, still demonstrating the specific quality of Richard's military intelligence applied to a problem that required engineering rather than battlefield command. Philip was losing this war. The same patience and strategic calculation that made him dangerous in the long run was a liability against Richard's faster, more aggressive operational style. Richard moved before Philip expected, took positions before they could be reinforced, exploited local intelligence and local relationships in ways that a king governing from Paris could not replicate in the Norman borderlands. Thomas Asbridge, one of the better recent historians of Richard's reign, has argued that had Richard lived another decade, he might very plausibly have reversed everything Philip had built in France, that the English territories on the continent that John would lose catastrophically in 1204 might have been secured for a much longer period, and medieval European history might have taken a substantially different course. The death that prevented this was not heroic in the way the legend required. In March 1119, Richard was in the Limousin, suppressing a revolt by the Viscount of Limoges. He came to the small castle of Chalus-Chabrol, held by 2 knights and a handful of defenders. It was not a significant siege. The castle should have fallen in days. On March 26, 1199, Richard was walking around the castle's perimeter in the evening without his full mail, inspecting the walls in the casual way he'd been doing since his first campaigns in Aquitaine 2 decades earlier. The habit of a man who had survived extraordinary danger so many times that ordinary caution had perhaps lost some of its urgency. On the wall above him, a single crossbowman named Pierre Bazile, who had apparently lost brothers earlier in the siege, and who was defending with a crossbow and a frying pan as his improvised shield, fired a bolt that struck Richard in the left shoulder. The wound seemed manageable at first. It was not. The bolt broke during extraction. The wound was torn, infection set in, and gangrene followed within days. Eleanor of Aquitaine, almost 80 years old, made the journey from Fontevraud Abbey to Chalus to be with her son. She arrived before he died. Richard spent the time composing his affairs, arranging his succession, leaving his treasure to various purposes, conducting himself with the specific composure that the chivalric tradition required in the face of death, and that Richard, who had thought about death his entire adult life, apparently found it possible to achieve. Before he died, he asked that Pierre Bazile be brought to him. The boy, young, apparently an adolescent, not a professional soldier, had killed his king's brothers in the siege and had shot the king out of grief rather than military strategy. Richard, by the standards of medieval warfare, had every right to order his torture and execution. He pardoned him instead. ordered him given a sum of money and released him. Whether this act of mercy was the expression of genuine magnanimity, of the chivalric code's specific demand for mercy toward a brave enemy, or simply of the exhausted clarity that dying men sometimes achieve, is not recoverable from the sources. The pardon was real. The money was real. What Richard's mercenaries subsequently did to Pierre Basile, the accounts suggest he was flayed and hanged after Richard's death, his king's order apparently insufficient to protect him once the king was no longer alive to enforce it, was not Richard's responsibility. He died on April 6, 1199, at 41 years old. He was taken to Fontevraud Abbey, where his heart was buried separately at Rouen, the Norman capital, and the rest of him was laid at the feet of his father's effigy. The 3 lions on his coat of arms, which he'd introduced on his second Great Seal in 1198, became the heraldic symbol of the English crown and remain so today. The medieval world's response to Richard's death was immediate and unusually intense, even by the standards of a political culture that treated the deaths of great rulers as events of cosmological as well as political significance. The court poets and chroniclers who had been celebrating him throughout his career shifted immediately to lament, and the lament took on a quality of genuine personal loss rather than merely ceremonial mourning. The troubadour Gaucelm Fidit, who had known Richard and whose poem mourning his death, the Fort's Chaucer Esquetot lo Major Dan, is one of the most celebrated of the surviving Occitan plans or laments, described the king's death as the loss of the greatest thing in the world, using language that the genre's conventions made available, but that contemporaries apparently found accurately descriptive rather than merely formulaic. This immediate response matters because it tells you something about how Richard was perceived in his own time rather than in retrospect. He was not merely celebrated after death as a great king, in the way that comfortable retrospective revision tends to celebrate all kings who have died long enough ago. He was celebrated as a genuinely extraordinary figure while he was alive, by people who had direct experience of him, and the transition to posthumous legend was therefore more a continuation and crystallization of existing sentiment than a posthumous revision of a more complicated reality. The specific image that the medieval tradition fixed on was the image of the man who had come closest to Jerusalem without quite reaching it. The failure to recover Jerusalem, the thing the Crusade had been for, the city the king had twice refused to assault because the military situation did not justify it, became in retrospect the defining mark of the campaign, not as a failure but as a tragic near miss. The king who almost did the impossible thing and was prevented not by cowardice or incompetence but by circumstance. This is a specific and coherent narrative position, and it has the quality of having been partly constructed by Richard himself during the campaign. His public expressions of grief at being unable to take Jerusalem, his statement that he could not bear to see what he could not deliver, suggest a man who understood both the military reality and the mythological significance of his situation, and who was already managing the narrative of his own legend while it was happening. The legacy Richard left was complicated in exactly the ways his life had been complicated. For England, his reign was in practical administrative terms not much. 6 months of royal presence, enormous taxation, political instability during his absences. But before we render that judgment, it is worth understanding what a medieval king was actually supposed to do, what the job description was, because the modern instinct to evaluate a medieval monarch by how much time he spent in his realm misunderstands the specific role that 12th century kingship required. A medieval king's primary functions were, in rough order of importance, to defend the realm and its interests in war, to lead the military and diplomatic activities that determined the realm's position in the European state system, to maintain justice, primarily by ensuring the legal system functioned and by being available in person as the ultimate court of appeal, and to manage the relationship between the crown and the great magnates whose cooperation was necessary for any large-scale political action. The administrative governance of the kingdom, the day-to-day management of the fiscal system, the local justice, the border control, the maintenance of roads and bridges and so on, was in the 12th century the job of the king's administrative apparatus, not of the king himself. Henry II had built that administrative apparatus into something of the most effective in Europe, and Richard inherited it in working order. The fact that it continued to work during his absences is in some ways evidence of the system's quality rather than of Richard's negligence. A system that collapses when the king is absent is a more fragile system than one that functions through institutional inertia. English governance under Richard's Justicars and under Eleanor's oversight did not collapse. It continued, imperfectly, to function. What Richard genuinely failed to do, what a more responsible king would have done and what his father had done, was to invest personal energy in the ongoing political management of England's internal affairs, the ongoing negotiation with the barons and the church and the counties that kept the political balance in equilibrium. Henry II had been constantly present, constantly engaged, constantly managing the specific political relationships on which royal authority depended. Richard was not, and the political tensions that John's reign would eventually make catastrophic were building during Richard's absence in ways that a more attentive king might have managed more carefully. For the Crusader states, the contribution was more specific and more consequential. To understand what Richard's campaign actually preserved, you need to understand the specific situation of the Crusader presence in the Levant in 1192 and what would have happened in the absence of the Third Crusade. After Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem, the Crusader states had been reduced to essentially a single city, Tyre, held by Conrad of Montferrat, whose specific decision to refuse Saladin's terms and defend the city against Saladin's siege in late 1187 had preserved the one significant Crusader foothold on the Palestinian coast. Saladin controlled everything else, not just Jerusalem but virtually the entire former territory of the Kingdom of Jerusalem plus most of the Principality of Antioch's vulnerable southern territories. The Crusader military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, had been decimated at Hattin. The secular baronage was in prison, ransomed or dead. The Third Crusade arrived in the context of an existing situation that was closer to the final extinction of the Crusader states than to the comfortable position of the pre-Hattin era. What Richard achieved was not the recovery of Jerusalem. He did not achieve that, but the recovery and fortification of the Palestinian coast from Tyre to Jaffa, the restoration of the Crusader states to a defensible territorial core, and the establishment of Acre as a functioning capital with the commercial infrastructure that made the entire Crusader project economically viable. The kingdom that existed after 1192 was smaller than the pre-Hattin kingdom, more militarily coherent and better positioned, both defensively and commercially, than what had existed in the decade before Hattin. The specific architectural and organisational work Richard did in his year in Palestine, the fortification of the coastal towns, the management of the army's supply system, the diplomatic framework established with the treaty, provided the Crusader states with the basis for nearly another century of existence. The final fall of Acre in 1291 was the end of the Crusader experiment, and it came nearly 100 years after Richard had secured the coast. The relationship between Richard's specific military contributions and this century of continued Crusader existence is real, but should not be overstated. Many other factors, the death of Saladin in 1193 and the subsequent fragmentation of the Ayyubid coalition, the Mongol invasions that disrupted the Muslim world in the mid-13th century and temporarily created conditions that were favourable to the Crusader states, the continued support of European powers through later crusades and through commercial relationships contributed to the survival. Richard's contribution was to prevent extinction in 1192, not to guarantee survival indefinitely. That is a specific and significant contribution, and the Crusader state's continued existence for another century justifies taking it seriously without inflating it into something larger. For the Crusader states, the contribution was more specific and more consequential. The Third Crusade secured the coastal territories that allowed the Kingdom of Jerusalem to persist for another century. The treaty with Saladin was diplomatically sophisticated. It extracted better terms than the military situation strictly warranted, and provided a framework for Christian-Muslim relations that served the Crusader states throughout the remaining decades of Saladin's life and beyond. Whether it could have achieved more, whether a different approach might have recovered Jerusalem, is the question that historians have continued to argue about, and the consensus leans toward the view that Richard's assessment of what was achievable was correct. Jerusalem, taken with insufficient forces to defend it, would have been lost again within months. For the medieval imagination, his contribution was the living example of the chivalric ideal at its most fully realized. The code of chivalry that the troubadour tradition had elaborated and the crusading ideology had given military application was, for most of its practitioners, an aspiration that reality consistently fell short of. Richard was the exception, the man who actually fought the way the romances said knights should fight, who demonstrated by his specific conduct at specific battles that the code was not merely aesthetic fantasy, but a description of achievable excellence. The admiration of his enemies, most crucially Saladin's court, whose chroniclers recorded their respect for Richard's military conduct with a candour that had no political reason for flattery, is the most credible testimony to this. Men trying to kill you do not admire you unless there is something genuinely worth admiring. The Robin Hood legend, which developed in the 2 centuries after Richard's death and which consistently used Richard as the rightful king, whose return would justify the outlaw band's defiance of his corrupt deputies, gave him an extraordinary second life in English popular culture that had essentially nothing to do with the historical Richard. But the Robin Hood legend is only one strand of a much more extensive process of cultural appropriation that Richard's story has undergone across 8 centuries, and the variety of what different ages have made of him is itself one of the more revealing things about the legend. Each generation has found in Richard the Lionheart a different mirror for its own concerns, its own values, its own anxieties about courage and power, and the relationship between martial excellence and political responsibility. Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, published in 1819 and one of the most widely read novels of the 19th century, gave the Victorian and Romantic world their Richard, a king in disguise who moves through his own kingdom anonymously, a crusading hero who returns from the Holy Land to discover treachery and set it right, a figure of magnanimous justice whose forgiveness of his enemies is as impressive as his valour against them. Scott's Richard is a romantic hero in the specific 19th century sense, glamorous, physically magnificent, fundamentally good beneath the complications of his circumstances, ultimately redemptive. This Richard served the Victorian idealization of medieval chivalry that was one of the period's characteristic cultural preoccupations, and it served the specific political need of a period that was anxious about the relationship between individual heroism and institutional governance. about whether the qualities that made a man admirable in personal terms were also the qualities that made a state prosperous and just. Scott's answer was essentially yes, and the legend of Richard supported it. The 20th century was less comfortable with the answer. The two world wars, the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, and the general catastrophe of modern organised violence produced a historical consciousness that was sceptical of military glamour in ways that the Victorian period had not been, and the Richard who emerged from serious 20th century historical scholarship was a progressively less romantic and more ambiguous figure. The historians who looked most carefully at the primary sources, at the chronicles, the administrative records, the treaty documents, the accounts of the Acre massacre, found a Richard who was genuinely extraordinary as a commander and genuinely irresponsible as a king, who was capable of both magnanimity and atrocity, whose legend had been built in part by selecting from the available evidence those episodes that fit the chivalric ideal and setting aside the ones that did not. This is the Richard that serious historical scholarship has settled on more or less, and it is in many ways a more interesting Richard than the Legends version. The gap between the extraordinary warrior and the negligent king is not a reason to dismiss him, but a reason to think more carefully about what military genius is, about what it costs and what it produces, about the relationship between the specific excellences of a particular kind of person and the broader range of qualities that institutional responsibility requires. Richard is a case study in the way that individual greatness and political virtue can come apart, in the way that the thing a person is best at, pursued with total commitment, can leave other equally important things entirely unattended. Of his corrupt deputies, gave him an extraordinary second life in English popular culture that had essentially nothing to do with the historical Richard. The historical Richard barely knew England existed as a cultural entity, distinct from the Angevin Empire he governed from French castles. The legendary Richard, the good king whose absence allows tyranny, whose return will restore justice, was a construction of English popular culture's specific needs at the specific moment when baronial power and royal authority were being renegotiated in the aftermath of Magna Carta. It served those needs effectively precisely because the historical Richard was sufficiently remote, sufficiently shadowy in English memory, that the construction could proceed without too many inconvenient facts getting in the way. The historical Richard was more interesting than the Legends Richard, and more unsettling, and ultimately more worth knowing. He was a man who could inspire absolute loyalty and inflict mass murder in the same campaign, who could write poetry of genuine quality and order the slaughter of thousands, who came within sight of the thing he had devoted his life to and turned back correctly, twice, who pardoned the boy who killed him and couldn't save the boy from his own men, who governed France with exceptional skill and England with cheerful indifference, who was in almost every important sense a Frenchman who happened to be King of England, and who became, in English cultural memory, the ideal English king. The contradiction is not a flaw in the story, it is the story. The Abbey of Fontevraud sits in the Loire Valley of western France, and before we arrive there, it is worth following Richard's story one step further than his death, into the immediate political consequences that his dying without a legitimate heir produced. John, who had been named heir in Richard's final weeks, became king in April 1199. The contrast between the two brothers, in military ability, in administrative attention, in personal character, in relationship to the people they governed, was so complete that contemporaries and historians alike have found it difficult to discuss John without the shadow of Richard falling across the comparison. John was not the cartoon villain that the Robin Hood legend made him. He was a capable administrator in some respects, more engaged with the specific mechanics of English governance than his brother had ever been, and the administrative records of his reign are among the most detailed of the medieval period precisely because he was paying attention to what they recorded. But he was also suspicious, occasionally cruel, politically inept in the specific ways that mattered most for the Anglo-Norman political settlement, and catastrophically unlucky or catastrophically incompetent in his French campaigns, probably some combination of both. By 1204, John had lost Normandy, Anjou, Maine and Touraine to Philip Sen, the continental territories that the Angevin Empire had assembled over half a century, lost in a campaign whose specific military and diplomatic failures reflected both Philip's tactical skill and John's inability to manage either his barons or his military situation with anything approaching Richard's competence. The Angevin Empire that Henry Thecke had built and Eleanor had sustained, and Richard had recovered from the ravages of the captivity period, was gone, reduced to England and the parts of Gascony that John managed to hold through the rest of his reign. The world that Richard had died fighting to preserve was dismantled within 5 years of his death by the brother he had named as his heir. This counterfactual, what Richard might have preserved if he had lived, is one of the more tempting in medieval history, and historians have generally been appropriately cautious about it. But it is not unreasonable to observe that the specific combination of military ability and political relationships that Richard brought to the French campaign of 1194 to 1199 was demonstrably more effective against Philip V than anything John subsequently managed, and that the trajectory of those 5 years, in which Richard was recovering lost territory rather than losing it, was not pointing in the same direction that the subsequent years took. The Abbey of Fontevraud sits in the Loire Valley of western France, and the tombs it contains are among the most remarkable survivals of medieval Europe. The effigy of Richard, carved in stone, painted in polychrome that has mostly faded now, the king in full armour with crown and sword and his hands folded across his chest, lies at the feet of his father's effigy. Henry II is there, the man Richard fought and hounded to his death, and whose body he stood silent before at Chinon, and whom he arranged posthumously to spend eternity before. Eleanor of Aquitaine is there, her effigy holding an open book, still reading, still watching, the woman who outlived them all. Berengaia's effigy is not there. She's at Leppo in Maine, in the abbey she founded, the Queen of England who never went to England. The ruins of Chateau Gaillard are there above the Seine, still imposing, still demonstrating the specific quality of intelligence that Richard brought to the problem of military architecture. The 3 lions that Richard placed on his coat of arms are on the English royal standard tonight, wherever that is, as they have been for 8 centuries. Somewhere in the valley of the Loire, above where the river moves through its calm summer course through the vineyards, the late light is touching the towers of Fontevraud Abbey, and inside the church, in the stone, the family that made the Angevin Empire is lying in the arrangement Richard designed, himself at his father's feet, Henry at no one's, Eleanor forever reading her book. He came within sight of Jerusalem twice. He turned back both times. He forgave the boy who killed him. He died of an infection in a minor siege in the Limousin, far from everything he had fought for, his mother at his side, the 3 lions already going on to his second seal. The legend began before he was cold. Let all of that settle around you now. The Loire is quiet tonight, as it always is. The abbey is quiet, the stone effigies are in their positions, as they have been for 8 centuries, the polychrome fading in the filtered light, the sword at Richard's side, the same sword that was there when Eleanor last saw it, when she made the journey from Fontevraud to Charlus to be with her son at the end, when she came back to Fontevraud and buried him. The crusade is over. Jerusalem is still there, as it has always been. The Lionheart is in the stone. Rest easy.